Paul is upset. Paul is livid. He's saying, I tried to help you guys do this. Have you ever had that conversation with your child where at some point you say, didn't we talk about this? I kind of see Paul saying, didn't we talk about this? Well, this goes back to a story that Paul relates in what we now call the second chapter of Galatians. The church in those days, as you know, was comprised of Jews. Jesus was a Jew. Peter was a Jew. All the disciples were Jews, and they were the ones who heard the Jesus story and were entrusted with it. But then something wonderful happened as they spread out, Philip and Paul and Peter and the other apostles, as they spread out around the region, non-Jewish people began to accept this great truth and want to follow Jesus as well. They were thrilled that this happened. The Bible usually calls them Gentiles, but the word's ethne, which means the nation. So you had the Jews and then the nations. And they said, it's so wonderful that they're accepting the call of Jesus on their lives. But they had a little conundrum then. See, we're Jews and we follow Jesus. Does that mean that these Gentiles have to become Jews before they can follow Jesus? They didn't know. So it was a big point of discussion. They tried their best to work through it. And they came to the conclusion, this is right about the time when they were going through all this. They came to the conclusion that no, Jesus is for everyone. You don't have to become a Jew to be a Jesus follower. And the people who were the most adamant that you didn't have to become a Jew were Peter, Paul. And so this incident happened in the city of Antioch. Some of the leaders from Jerusalem had come. They were the ones who weren't real sure. They were thinking maybe you should at least observe all the Jewish festivals and all the Jewish rites and all the Jewish traditions. At least you should do that. And Peter and Paul and those guys saying, no. You don't have to become Jewish to be a Christian. And one of the traditions that was such a big deal to them, a huge deal, was the tradition of the meal together, eating together. We're going to take the meal together a little bit. But beyond this, for them, it wasn't just a piece of bread and dipping it in the cup. It was a meal together. And they blew the whole culture away because they'd all eat together. In the Roman Empire of that day, it was very hierarchical. You know, landowners did not eat with poor people. Slave owners certainly did not eat with slaves. Men did not eat with women. Children were kind of pushed to the side. A senator in Rome would only eat with an elite group of people. It was the way society was supposed to work. You were supposed to eat with your own kind and just be with your own kind. And the Christians just blew this away. I mean, landowners were eating with peasants. Men were eating with women. Gentiles were eating with Jews. It was working. But then one day in Antioch, some of the guys came who weren't so sure about this. And Peter and Paul were there. And what happened was Peter was kind of afraid of what his Jewish brothers might think. So instead of doing what he'd always done, he kind of kept his distance from the Gentile believers and went back, I'm just going to be with the Jews. Paul was livid. This is on his mind when he writes Galatians. You can tell why he's so angry. You know, we don't know exactly what Paul looked like, but tradition says he was kind of a diminutive guy, bald-headed, beard. I like him. With like a sharp nose and sharp eyes. I picture him with those sharp eyes, you know, that I think when Paul wanted to, he could bring down the Death Star with his eyes. You know, I just think that. And in this particular case, he's saying that in front of all these people, Paul broke every rule of how leaders lead. He said, I confronted Peter to his face in front of all of them. Leaders aren't supposed to confront like this. He says, I to his face. I just see that pointed nose of Paul and his finger in Peter's face saying, what in the world are you doing? You and I have been proclaiming all over that we're all one in Christ Jesus, male and female, Jew and Gentile. And you're separating yourself? He said, I confronted him to his face because he was in the wrong. Hard to argue with that guy, especially in public. So in this setting, this is where Paul writes to the Galatian churches who've kind of fallen into this. He says, what are you thinking? What are you doing? And then he says something very important to us. He says, it's like you're turning away from the gospel to another gospel, which is no gospel at all. Now, I want us to think about that word gospel. We use it in a lot of different ways nowadays. Sometimes the word gospel is a musical genre. There's African-American gospel that's given so much to our culture through jazz and blues and gospel. There's Southern gospel that some of you were probably raised on. Sometimes we use the word gospel to mean truth, you know? It's the gospel truth. I'm not lying to you. But in the Christian community, many times this word gospel has just come across like a theological term, like the gospel is this thing we believe. Or someone will get a little spat over whether you should do something or not. Well, I don't know if that's true to the gospel or not. Or is that gospel? Remember one time I posted something that was very social justice oriented, and someone said, I don't see the gospel in that. But I want us to look at what the word really means. Very simple word. It's euangelion. The EU, epsilon, upsilon at the beginning. The EU means good. We use it all the time. Eucharist is good grace of God. A eulogy is good words about someone. So if you're asked to do a eulogy, it better be good. Don't be saying nasty stuff about the deceased, okay? Evangelion is euangelion, and that word angelion means a message. In fact, it's where the word angel comes from. In the scripture, an angel was simply a messenger. So Paul says, I'm astonished that you're rejecting the good news for something that's not good news at all. And someone who's asked you to follow a different good news. I think the English translation of the Bible, if I may humbly say so, should be changed, okay? I would love to be able to take every English translation of the Bible with an eraser and pen and just erase gospel and write the meaning, good news. Because it's not something abstract, it's something very, very raw. In fact, every time you read the New Testament, every time you run across the word gospel, don't read gospel, read good news. It's the rawness of that. Paul is saying what you are doing is not good news. What you are doing is bad news. This is bad news. You're destroying the church by what you're doing. Because we are called to be that community that embraces everyone. That's what we're called. And you're turning to another good news that ain't good news. You know, I know that preachers have this tendency to isolate one thing and say, this is central to the gospel, or this is central to the gospel. And I hate to do that because I think the gospel is this beautiful thing that Phil Stout doesn't get to define. But what Paul seems to be saying here is that anytime we separate the grace of God, that some people deserve grace more than others, he says that is not the gospel. Or again, the rawness of his language, that is not good news. That is bad news. And Paul's not even writing theology here. He's not talking about the way we think through certain things. He's talking about the way we live. He's saying, you guys are destroying what Jesus came to bring. That's pretty wild, isn't it? That he makes that like a centerpiece of what it is to be the church. It's an amazing thing. And as we go in the book of Galatians, especially if you sat in the reading today at 9:30, there's some really challenging stuff in there, and to try to figure out where Paul says, no, these things you thought were right all along aren't. There's something else that's more important. But as we go through this, we're going to be learning more and more that this grace that God gives us is to permeate everything we do in every way we do it. Some people are a little afraid. Well, if you say everyone is always welcome, then what about people who really shouldn't be welcome yet? You know, what about the ones who need to jump through some hoops first? You know, they need to get their act together first. And what if our acceptance of everyone seems like we're accepting anything? See, people get nervous on this. I think we need to go back to what we've been talking about of the church is not a bounded community where we put up fences and say, here's the parameters of the church. To get in here, you got to conform to a certain way to get into the parameters. It's not that, the boarded community. It's not the fuzzy community we've talked about, the community that just isn't really sure why they're even here. We're just all getting together and saying nice things. They're not really sure why they're here. Or is it a centered community where there's something in the center that we pursue? The image of the fences is for a farmer to keep his cattle in and keep predators out. But then in the middle of that fenced-in area is a well, just a wellspring that the animals would want to feed at. We're saying we don't need the boundaries. Paul is saying we don't need the boundaries. And we'll read next week about what he says when we don't need the law anymore. What does that mean? We don't need to just be a group of people who have no direction. But in the middle, there's this well of grace this well of mercy, this ocean of mercy that liberates us. And for us to be the church, it's this thing of going together toward the well, going toward the ocean of mercy, going toward Jesus. I love that. I love this. I didn't wear my T-shirt today, my Anyone T-shirt, because it's black and I know it's going to be hot out here, but I got the band on. You know, when we say anyone, we're not making a theological statement. We're not saying this is what we believe. We're not just making a branding statement, okay? This is not an ad campaign. We're saying this is what we want to be. Not what we want to think. This is what we want to be. We want to be that community that says we're all together. We're all together in this. We're all going in the same direction toward Jesus. And we need to be humble enough when we fail, because we will fail, right? We'll fail. Everybody fails. I would just ask that we all be humble enough to say this is our aspiration, and then when we need to be checked, we would check one another again humbly to say that we could do this. We're doing this. God is calling us to this great thing. There's something that happens in a body of believers and in an individual. I probably shared with you before. I kind of grew up in a kind church, and I had fabulous parents, but it was a pretty rigid place. You know, there wasn't a lot of freedom. You know, I got older. I used to say you can't move without getting busted. You know, it was like a box in there. And as I learned over time that there's this thing that happens that transforms us. When I give grace to others in increasing measure, I find myself giving myself grace in increasing measure. The other is true too. When I find myself giving myself grace in increasing measure, it makes it easier for me to give everyone else grace. It's this beautiful thing, and we're going to look at that in the coming weeks where he says, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Y'all familiar with Mr. Rogers? Look at that already. Fred Rogers was a Presbyterian pastor, went to seminary and became a Presbyterian pastor, and felt like his calling was to do something that I don't think anybody had thought of before, to use this medium of television to show children how worthwhile they were, to show them how loved they were. It's just an amazing thing. And I mean, he's been in our thoughts a lot in the last few years because he passed away, and then there was a Tom Hanks movie where Tom Hanks was Mr. Rogers. Who would have thought Forrest Gump could be Mr. Rogers? That was a wild one. And then there were some documentaries. And Carol and I went to this theater in Ann Arbor that has the big theater, but then smaller rooms, and they kind of show some documentaries before they actually come out. And so we were watching this documentary on Mr. Rogers, fascinating in all kinds of ways. And at one point in the documentary, they show this clip, some pundits on a news channel, and they're talking about how terrible Mr. Rogers is. They're saying what he does is he tells children that they're good and accepted before they've done anything. He's discouraging them from being productive members of society. He's discouraging them from knowing you've got to earn your way. And, you know, I'm sitting there almost laughing. And then when it goes to the end of that clip, the last thing that was said blew my mind. The person referring to Mr. Rogers said, "That is evil." Mr. Rogers evil? What were they saying? They were saying, we don't understand grace. We don't understand being made in the image of God. We just understand your worth is based on what you've done. Your worth is based on something else. And it's our job to withhold grace until you've performed. That, my friend, is not the good news. That's opposite of the good news. That's no good news at all. That's bad news. It's bad news for our kids. It's bad news for me. It's bad news for you. It's bad news for every one of us. And I thank God for Fred Rogers, even with those dumb, hokey puppets that say, I mean, it was crazy stuff he did. But I'm thankful that there was a man in the midst of all of our society who said to kids, by his presence, this is what Jesus is like. And that's what he's called us to do. Paul says, that, my friends, that's good news.